This is the continued story of the book I Saw God's Hand by E.L. Martin, as retold to the children of the Watertown SDA Church Primary Sabbath School. I'm your storyteller, Austin Bacchus. Let's go.
A promise is a promise. The sting of the morning tropical sun could scarcely yet be felt as I stepped ashore with two teachers at a small village in the headwaters of the Tarama River. As was my usual approach, I first cared for several sick people and gave a number of injections. Then we gathered the villagers around and began telling the story of the great physician. I hadn't been speaking long when I noticed that, despite the people's interest, agitated warriors were reaching for their bows and arrows and spears, with their eyes not on me but on the chief. Their actions suggested that trouble was brewing. It could lead to bloodshed. Just then a chief with about 20 warriors armed to the teeth stepped onto the village compound. I knew at once they were ready for mischief. Through 2 or 3 interpreters, I was able to speak to the hostile chief and his warriors who had just arrived. It took only a few minutes to find out the cause of the trouble. 2 months before, this visiting tribe had brought a little girl to the headwater village and sold her for an axe, or at least the promise of an axe. Then apparently several weeks had gone by and no axe had been paid to them. So now it was a case of pay us an axe or else. I asked the hostile chief with his warriors to sit down while I talked to him, but he had no intention of sitting down until he got his axe. Finally, I convinced him that if he and his warriors would sit down and listen to my story, I'd give him a new axe that I had on the boat. So we told him the Bible story. It was a slow process. We had to use 4 interpreters to get to his language. I had been speaking only a few minutes when the visiting chief jumped to his feet and told me neither he nor his people had ever heard this story and asked whether I would come and tell his people. I agreed, and as the story continued, the chief interrupted several times again, urging that I should come and tell his people the same story. Each time I agreed I would. I'd come someday. By the time I finished my meeting, the formerly hostile warrior chief came over and hugged me with all his strength. You can imagine what my white clothes looked like from all the pig grease that he had smeared on his body. Then I asked the chief where his people lived, expecting he would say maybe 3, 4, 5 hours away. The old chief waved his hands toward the mountains, and with his little stone axe he cut a notch in a log. "You start at daylight," he said, "and walk all day till the sun has set. That is that mark." Then he cut another, and spoke the same words, and proceeded to cut another. I was beginning to wish I had never made the promise that one day I would come and tell the story to his people. He cut another notch, then another. When he at last stopped cutting the notches, I counted them and found no fewer than 10 notches. That meant 10 days hard walking. No one should assume that it would be possible to simply walk there in 10 days and out in 10 days and fulfill my God-given task. One would need to spend several days among the chief's people, and then one has to make friends in every language area that he passes through. I estimated it would take 8 to 10 weeks to make such a trip effectively. I asked the old chief to give me some idea of how many people lived in his area. He told me there were many thousands. Again, I assured him one day I would come and visit. To break a promise like this would lead to serious repercussions. But the days, weeks, and months slipped by, and I found it impossible to fulfill the promise I had made. This worried me. The more I prayed about it, the greater became my awareness that a promise had been made and remained unfulfilled. My heart beat a little faster when I learned that the Tari Valley area had been opened up by the government. It seemed to me that the Tari Valley might serve as a starting place to fulfill my promise to the old chief, because by my reckoning, I could reach his area in 2 or 3 days walking from the Tari Valley, whereas to go in from the head of the Tarama River would have meant more than 200 miles of traveling. Several times I asked in the yearly and half-yearly committee meetings that we might do something about opening up the Tari Valley. Year after year, we didn't have enough funds, and to add to the burden the Lord had laid on me, I heard that 2 other church mission bodies had already become well established in the Tari Valley, meaning other denominations of missionaries, not Seventh-day Adventists. Imagine my joy when one day, while sitting in committee at the headquarters of the Union Mission, I learned that funds had been made available to open up the Tari Valley. A motion was passed that Pastors Maberly, Grieve, and I would make a trip to the Tari area. The 3 of us lost little time chartering a light aircraft. We took with us a tent and bedding and clothes to last us a week, as well as some goods to trade with the tribespeople. The Tari Valley people gave us quite a welcome, but we were disappointed to learn that government restrictions would keep us within a 1-mile radius of the airstrip. In other words, they could only choose a place to build their mission within 1 mile of where the airstrip was located. And in our search for suitable land to establish a mission, we would have to be accompanied by an armed local policeman at all times. So the next day we began the difficult task of making friends with the Tari people, and at the same time asking whether they would be prepared to sell us land. Actually, we were not able to purchase any land outright, but when the owners of the land who are willing to sell can be found, then the land is purchased by the government and it is rented out to us for a 99-year term. We felt the Master was with us because on the second day we found a suitable piece of land, and the people were willing to let us have it. We arranged to meet the owners the next morning at the government station to complete the necessary documents. But when the next day came, the government patrol officer informed us the people did not want to sell us the land. So this meant starting all over again. We searched another day and a half, and we were told of people who wished to make ground available to us. It wasn't quite as suitable, but we decided we'd better close the deal anyway. So arrangements were made to meet at the government office the following morning to sign on the bottom line. But alas, the owners refused to sign, saying they had decided not to sell. We began our search all over again. After 2 days hard going, we came up with what appeared to be our next best situation. Yes, the people wanted us and were prepared to sell. So the third time we planned to meet at the government office the next morning, you'll understand that each offer to sell was made by different groups of people. We felt that we had come to the end of our rope because again we were told this third group had decided not to sell it to us. Soon after coming out of the government office, I spoke to the government interpreter who spoke Motuan, so the Tari people were unable to understand our discussion. Why is it that every time we find suitable land and the people are willing to sell, they change their minds when we get to the government office? The interpreter told me the government office had nothing to do with the refusals. We were being followed at a distance by representatives of the 2 other church missions. And when we would find people who were willing to sell, those other missionaries would go to them at night and tell the people that if they were to let the Seventh-day Adventist mission come into the Tari Valley, then they would have to give up their multiple wives and smoking and chewing betel nut and eating pigs. Then the people would change their minds. It seemed we would have to admit defeat. We spent another 2 days searching, but by this time the people showed little interest and wanted to even show us land and no interest in selling. We seemed to be faced with no alternative but to fly out again and wait until such time as the Master opened the way. I began to feel more and more frustrated. How would I fulfill my promise to the old chief? We decided to spend much time in prayer that night. For surely if God wanted us to establish work here, nothing could stand in the way. Only the angels of heaven recorded the anguish of our prayers as us 3 pastors poured out our hearts to the Master. We challenged him to do something so our costly trip would not be in vain. Toward daylight the next morning, I heard someone tapping on the outside of the tent. I stepped out to find a lone warrior who surprisingly spoke to me in Motuan. He told me that he and his 2 brothers were going to offer us the very best ground in the area, and that they would take us to see the land as soon as we wished. Then if we were satisfied, they would sign it over to us the following morning at the government office. He also had something to say about not discussing whether we were pleased with the offer because he didn't want anyone else to know that he was selling that land to us. He returned some hours later with his 2 brothers and a local policeman. Our hearts were filled to overflowing, for within just a short distance from the airstrip, we saw the best land that we had seen in our whole search. This was the answer to our prayers, and the next day at the government office, we lost little time in completing the necessary documents. All 3 owners placed their mark on the paper. The government officer's jaw dropped open, and he said, "How did you get the best piece of ground in the whole valley?" Today, we have one of the most beautiful mission stations in the whole of our highland work in the Tari Valley and have baptized scores of the Tari people. But several years went by before I figured out exactly how our prayers came to be answered so marvelously. While we were being frustrated day by day in our search for land with the constant refusals to sell to us, word of our arrival in the area reached the old chief, the one to whom I had given the promise years before that one day I would come and tell the story. When he was told that I and 2 other white men were in the area under his control trying to purchase land, and after he had established the fact that I was definitely the one he had met at the Tarama River, he sent 3 of his warriors with instructions to give us as much as we needed of the very best ground they owned. Surely the Master works things out in his own ways.
Be sure to tune in next time for more stories from the book I Saw God's Hand by E.L. Martin. And meanwhile, feel free to check out these videos as well as others on my YouTube channel with many more mission and Bible stories for kids and adults. God bless you.